Rain slammed against the frosted glass of the Brass Griffin, Boston's most pretentious culinary trap. Charlotte Henderson, scrubbing a sticky mahogany table, looked like just another exhausted waitress trapped in the brutal service industry. She watched as a shivering, soaking wet elderly man was aggressively shoved toward the door by her tyrannical manager. Without hesitating, she intervened, bought the freezing man a hot meal, and was instantly fired for her insubordination. But her arrogant boss made two catastrophic miscalculations. First, he didn't realize the ragged stranger was sitting on an ocean of sudden wealth. Second, he had absolutely no idea that his lowly waitress was actually the billionaire CEO of the restaurant's parent conglomerate, executing a covert audit. By sunrise, the tables wouldn't just be turned, they would be completely destroyed. The Brass Griffin was supposed to be the crown jewel of Apex Hospitality Group, located in the affluent heart of Boston. It boasted a menu where a simple truffle risotto cost more than a minimum wage worker made in a week. Yet, for the past 3 quarters, profits had been violently bleeding out, and the online reviews painted a grim picture of a toxic environment and plummeting standards. Sitting in her glass-walled penthouse office, 50 stories above the city, Charlotte Henderson had grown tired of reading sanitized reports from her regional directors. At 32, Charlotte had transformed Apex Hospitality from a struggling domestic chain into a global billionaire-dollar empire. She was ruthless in the boardroom, but deeply, fiercely protective of the foundational values her late father had instilled in her hospitality meant taking care of people. It was a simple ethos that the Brass Griffin seemed to have entirely forgotten. Instead of sending another corporate auditor in a suit, Charlotte fabricated a background check, created a fake social security profile, and hired herself as Charlotte Smith, a waitress desperate for the evening shift. For 2 weeks, she endured the physical agony of the floor. Her feet ached, her hands were calloused from hauling heavy trays of ceramic plates, and her patience was stretched to its absolute limit. But the physical labor was nothing compared to the emotional toll of working under the franchise manager, Rick Smith. Rick was a man whose arrogance was outmatched only by his sheer incompetence. He wore heavily perfumed cologne, sported a slicked-back hairstyle that screamed of mid-level management desperation, and treated his staff like indentured servants. He regularly skimmed the tip pool to cover his own inventory mistakes, berated the kitchen staff until they walked out mid-shift, and openly mocked customers who didn't order the most expensive bottles of wine. Charlotte documented every single infraction. She had a hidden camera in her uniform button and a microscopic audio recorder tucked into her apron. She was building a flawless, airtight case to not only terminate Rick's franchise agreement, but to personally ensure he never worked in the hospitality industry again. It was a torrential Friday night when the breaking point finally arrived. The restaurant was packed with local socialites and arrogant investment bankers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck. Outside, a freak nor'easter had plunged the city into a freezing, miserable deluge. Charlotte was balancing 3 plates of pan-seared scallops when she saw him. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant creaked open, letting in a bitter blast of wind. Standing in the foyer was an older man. His clothes were drenched, clinging to his frail frame. He wore a faded, oversized tweed coat that had seen better decades, and his shoes were scuffed, waterlogged boots. His silver hair was plastered to his forehead, and his hands trembled violently from the biting cold. He didn't look like a beggar, but he clearly looked like a man who had lost a battle with the elements and was desperate for a brief sanctuary. He took a hesitant step onto the pristine, imported Italian marble floor, leaving a small puddle of rainwater in his wake. "Excuse me," the old man rasped, his voice barely audible over the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy chatter. "Could I just wait here for a moment, just until the rain lets up? I've lost my keys and my phone in the storm." Before the hostess could even respond, Rick Smith materialized from the dining room like a shark smelling blood in the water. His face twisted into a mask of utter disgust as he looked the old man up and down. "Absolutely not," Rick hissed, his voice dripping with venom. He stepped into the old man's personal space, intentionally trying to intimidate him. "This is a 5-star establishment, not a homeless shelter. Look at the mud you're tracking onto my floor. You are disturbing my guests. Get out. Now. Please," the old man said, his teeth chattering. "I have nowhere to go. Just 15 minutes by the radiator. I'm freezing to the bone." "I don't care if you're freezing to death," Rick snapped, his voice rising, drawing the attention of several nearby tables. Some of the wealthy patrons scoffed, turning their noses up at the wet man. "You are an eyesore. You are bad for business. If you don't leave this instant, I will have the police drag you out for trespassing." Charlotte froze. The plates of scallops in her hands suddenly felt weightless as a cold fury ignited in her chest. She had seen Rick be cruel, but this was a profound lack of basic human decency. This was the exact antithesis of everything Apex Hospitality stood for. She quickly set the plates down at her assigned table, ignoring the confused look of the diners, and marched straight toward the foyer. "Rick, stop!" Charlotte said, her voice cutting through the tension. It lacked the subservient tremor a waitress was supposed to have. It was the firm, authoritative voice of a CEO. Rick whipped his head around, his eyes narrowing at her. "Excuse me, Charlotte, are you speaking to me? Get back to your section immediately." "He's freezing," Charlotte said, stepping between Rick and the old man. She looked at the stranger, seeing the deep lines of exhaustion and cold in his face. "Sir, come with me. You can sit at my station in the back booth." The old man looked at her with wide, grateful eyes. I don't have any money on me. Miss, I lost my wallet in the dark when I dropped my keys." "You don't need any money," Charlotte said softly, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. "Your meal is on me tonight." The dining room went completely silent. The only sound was the jazz music playing softly from the overhead speakers and the violent rain lashing against the windows. Rick Smith's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight, starched collar. To be undermined by a waitress in front of his elite clientele was, to his fragile ego, an unforgivable crime. "Have you lost your absolute mind?" Rick whispered harshly, stepping closer to Charlotte so the patrons couldn't hear his profanity, though his body language screamed aggression. "You do not seat vagrants in my restaurant. You do not offer free food to street trash. You will throw him out right now, or you will pack your bags." Charlotte held her ground. She was a woman who regularly negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with the most ruthless corporate raiders on Wall Street. A pathetic, middle-management bully like Rick was nothing but a minor annoyance. He is a human being. "Rick," Charlotte replied, her tone icy and unwavering. "And he needs help. I am taking my designated employee meal break right now, and I am choosing to give my meal to him. I am also paying for a bowl of our lobster bisque out of my own pocket. Here." Charlotte reached into her apron and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, a prop she kept for emergencies, and slapped it hard onto the hostess stand. "That covers the soup and the mud on the floor. Now, I am seating my guest." Without waiting for his response, she gently placed a hand on the old man's damp shoulder and guided him away from the foyer. She led him to a secluded booth near the kitchen, away from the glaring eyes of the snobbish diners, and right next to a large heating vent. She quickly fetched a stack of dry, warm towels from the kitchen, ignoring the panicked whispers of the kitchen staff who knew a storm was brewing with the manager. She handed the towels to the man, poured him a large glass of hot water with lemon, and brought out a steaming, fragrant bowl of the restaurant's signature lobster bisque, paired with freshly baked artisan bread. "Thank you," the man whispered, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the spoon. He wrapped the warm towel around his neck, the color slowly returning to his pale cheeks. "You didn't have to do this. You're going to get into terrible trouble because of me, your boss." He looked furious. "Don't you worry about him." Charlotte smiled, sitting across from him for a brief moment. "He's just a man who forgot that the restaurant business is about hospitality, not just profits. I'm Charlotte. By the way, Anthony," the man replied, finally taking a sip of the rich, warm soup. A look of pure relief washed over his face. "Anthony Peterson, I won't forget this. Charlotte, people usually look right through me when I'm dressed like this. I was doing some late-night gardening at my estate, got locked out, and walked 3 miles in the rain trying to find a locksmith. You are a very rare soul." Before Charlotte could ask what kind of estate he was talking about, the heavy doors of the kitchen swung open with a violent crash. Rick marched toward the booth, flanked by 2 burly security guards he had pulled from the back alley entrance. He was practically vibrating with rage. He had completely abandoned any pretense of professionalism. "Get up!" Rick barked, pointing a trembling finger at Anthony. "Both of you out!" "Rick, I paid for his meal," Charlotte stated calmly, standing up to shield Anthony. "I don't care if you paid in solid gold." Rick screamed, spittle flying from his lips. The entire restaurant was watching now, forks suspended in midair. "You are insubordinate, disrespectful, and utterly worthless. You think you can make the rules in my restaurant? You are nothing. You are a dime-a-dozen plate carrier, and you are officially fired." He reached out, grabbed the collar of Charlotte's apron, and yanked it hard, tearing the fabric. "Take off the uniform, get your trash out of the lockers, and get out of my sight. And take this pathetic old beggar with you before I have you both arrested for trespassing." Anthony quickly stood up, leaving the half-eaten soup. "Please, don't fire her. I'll leave. It's my fault. It's too late for that, old man," Rick sneered, crossing his arms. "She's done." Charlotte slowly untied the torn apron. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Instead, a chilling, terrifyingly calm smirk played at the corner of her lips. She neatly folded the apron and placed it on the table. She looked Rick dead in the eyes, her gaze piercing right through his arrogant facade. "You are making a very large mistake." "Rick," Charlotte said, her voice dropping an octave, resonating with a quiet, dangerous power. "You have no idea who you just fired, or what you just threw away." "I threw away the garbage," Rick laughed mockingly. "Good riddance." Charlotte turned to Anthony. "Come on. Anthony, I'll drive you home. I have a car parked out back." She escorted the elderly man out through the front doors, leaving Rick to bask in his twisted sense of victory, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own professional death warrant. As Charlotte started her sleek, inconspicuous sedan and drove Anthony toward the address he provided. She tapped a button on her steering wheel. "Connect me to legal," she commanded her car's Bluetooth system. "Connecting," the AI replied. Charlotte glanced at the rearview mirror. Tomorrow, the brass griffin was going to experience an earthquake. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving Boston bathed in crisp, golden sunlight. Anthony Peterson didn't wake up in a cardboard box or a city shelter. He woke up in the master suite of a sprawling, 30-acre historic estate in Brookline. Anthony was not a homeless vagrant. He was a wildly eccentric, fiercely private retired hedge fund pioneer who had spent the last 40 years quietly amassing a fortune that rivaled small nations. He despised the trappings of wealth, preferring to spend his days tending to his massive rose gardens in ratty old clothes. But today, Anthony was not gardening. He stood in his walk-in closet, bypassing the comfortable flannels, and selected a bespoke, charcoal grey Savile Row suit that he hadn't worn in a decade. He paired it with a pristine white shirt, a silk tie, and a pair of polished Oxfords. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, his blue eyes sharp and utterly merciless. He walked down the grand staircase of his mansion, where his personal wealth manager, Jacob, was already waiting with a leather briefcase and a cup of black coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," Jacob said, noting the suit with a raised eyebrow. "We have an aggressive agenda today." "Very," Anthony said, taking a sip of the coffee. "Jacob, I need you to look up the franchise ownership of a restaurant downtown called the Brass Griffin. Specifically, I want to know who holds the debt for the lease and the operating licenses." Jacob opened his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. It took him less than 3 minutes to access the financial registries. The franchise rights and the commercial lease are held by an LLC owned by a man named Rick Smith. And, oh my, he is incredibly over-leveraged. He took out massive loans to cover operational losses over the last 2 years. He's currently 60 days delinquent on his primary commercial note with First Republic. Anthony smiled. It was a predatory smile. "Perfect. Call First Republic. Tell them Peterson Capital is buying Rick Smith's debt portfolio in its entirety. Offer them a 10% premium on the principal for an immediate, expedited transfer. Cash." Jacob's eyes widened. "Sir, that will cost millions. Are we foreclosing?" "We are executing a hostile takeover of the franchise rights," Anthony corrected, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "I want to own that restaurant by lunchtime. Then, I want you to draw up transfer papers. The new owner of that restaurant will be a young woman named Charlotte. She was a waitress there. Find her last name and put it in the documents." While Anthony's financial team went to war with the banks, deploying an overwhelming amount of liquid capital to force the immediate sale of Rick's defaulted loans, Charlotte Henderson was sitting in her glass penthouse. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, white designer pantsuit. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing the termination documents for Rick Smith. She had already drafted the paperwork to revoke his franchise license based on a breach of moral turpitude and financial mismanagement. Using the audio recordings from last night as the final nail in the coffin. "Miss Henderson," her chief operating officer said, bursting into her office without knocking, looking utterly bewildered. "We have a situation with the Boston franchise, the Brass Griffin." Charlotte looked up, a brow raised. "I'm already handling it." "Darian, I'm revoking Smith's license today." "You don't understand," Darian said, placing a tablet on her desk. "Smith doesn't own it anymore. As of 20 minutes ago, his bank forced a sale of his assets due to defaulted loans. A private equity firm called Peterson Capital bought the debt, seized the lease, and officially acquired the franchise rights. Charlotte blinked, taken aback. Peterson Capital, wait. Anthony Peterson. You know him? Darian asked. Because the craziest part is the transfer documents. Peterson Capital didn't buy it to keep it. They instantly transferred the sole ownership of the franchise to a newly formed holding company named Charlotte the Waitress, LLCE. Legal is losing their minds, trying to figure out what is going on. A genuine, shocked laugh escaped Charlotte's lips. The frail, freezing old man she had bought soup for was a corporate titan, and he had just bought her own restaurant for her, thinking she was unemployed and needed a job. The sheer poetry of the situation was staggering. Darian, Charlotte smiled, standing up and grabbing her designer coat. Cancel my morning meetings. I need to go visit my new restaurant. Down at the Brass Griffin. The lunch rush was just beginning to prep. Rick Smith was strutting through the dining room in a new, expensive suit he couldn't afford, barking orders at the exhausted staff. He felt invincible. He had asserted his dominance last night, and the kitchen was quiet and compliant. At exactly 11:30 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Anthony Peterson walked in. The transformation was so absolute that Rick didn't even recognize him at first. Anthony walked with the posture of a king, his bespoke suit radiating power and wealth. Behind him stood two men in dark suits carrying leather briefcases. "Welcome to the Brass Griffin," Rick said smoothly, slipping instantly into his sycophantic customer service persona, smelling the money on the men. "Do you have a reservation, gentlemen?" Anthony stopped in the center of the foyer, looking at the exact spot where he had stood shivering the night before. He turned his cold blue eyes to Rick. "I don't need a reservation. Rick," Anthony said, his voice smooth and commanding. Rick froze. The voice was familiar. He stared at the silver hair, the facial features. The blood slowly drained from Rick's face as the horrifying realization set in. It was the vagrant, the old man he had thrown out into the storm. "You," Rick stammered, taking a step back. "What is this? How did you get in here?" "I walked through the front door of my building," Anthony replied calmly. He snapped his fingers, and one of his lawyers stepped forward, slapping a thick stack of legal documents onto the hostess stand. "As of 10:45 a.m. this morning, your defaulted loans were purchased by my firm," Anthony explained, his voice echoing in the quiet restaurant. The staff had stopped prepping and were peering out from the kitchen, watching in stunned silence. "We called the debt. You couldn't pay. We seized the collateral. I now own the lease to this building, the equipment inside it, and the franchise rights you so poorly managed." Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. This is impossible. You can't just buy a restaurant overnight. When you have enough money, Rick, you can buy anything, Anthony said, stepping closer, towering over the broken manager. "Including karma. You fired a young woman last night for showing me the kindness that you are entirely devoid of. So, I bought this restaurant, and I am giving it to her." Before Rick could formulate a defense, the front doors opened again. Charlotte walked in, but she wasn't wearing a stained apron or carrying a tray. She was flanked by her own corporate security team, radiating the undeniable aura of a billionaire CEO. Anthony turned, a warm smile breaking across his face. "Charlotte, I was hoping I could track you down. I have a bit of a surprise for you." Charlotte walked up to Anthony, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Anthony, you are full of surprises, but I think I might have one for you. Two." She turned her gaze to Rick, who was now sweating profusely, looking between the billionaire investor and the waitress he had fired, his brain completely short-circuiting. "Hello, Rick." Charlotte smiled, a predator playing with its food. "It's time we had our performance review." The opulent foyer of the Brass Griffin felt as though the oxygen had been completely vacuumed from the room. The remaining waitstaff, the hostesses, and the culinary team peering through the porthole windows of the kitchen doors stood entirely paralyzed. Rick Smith's mind frantically tried to piece together the surreal tableau before him. On his left stood the homeless vagrant from the storm, now flanked by high-powered corporate attorneys and exuding the undeniable confidence of old money. On his right stood the waitress he had viciously fired just 12 hours ago, currently draped in a pristine, tailored suit that likely cost more than his car, guarded by an intimidating security detail. "Charlotte," Rick choked out, a nervous, high-pitched laugh escaping his throat. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "What is this? Is this some kind of sick joke? Did you hire these actors to scare me because you're bitter about losing your minimum wage job?" Anthony Peterson chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Actors Rick, you truly possess a breathtaking lack of situational awareness. Jacob, show him the foreclosure execution." Jacob, the sharp-eyed wealth manager, smoothly unlatched his briefcase and extracted a manila folder. He didn't hand it to Rick, he simply held it up, displaying the notarized bank seals and the bold, undeniable header, "Notice of seizure and asset transfer." "This is impossible," Rick stammered, stepping back as if the document were radioactive. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You can't do this. I have a binding contract. Even if you bought my debt, you can't just run an Apex hospitality franchise. You don't have the operational license. Corporate will completely destroy you. They will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. Rick clung to that thought like a life raft. He turned his attention away from Anthony and glared at Charlotte, his panic briefly transforming back into his familiar, comfortable arrogance. "And you?" Rick sneered, taking a step toward Charlotte, though her security detail instantly shifted forward, causing him to freeze. "You think dressing up and playing corporate spy is going to save you when the CEO of Apex finds out that some billionaire hedge fund dinosaur is trying to steal one of her flagship properties? She will obliterate both of you. You have no idea the kind of power Apex wields." Charlotte didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply offered a terrifyingly serene smile that made Rick's blood run completely cold. "You're absolutely right, Rick," Charlotte said, her voice smooth as glass. "Apex Hospitality does wield an immense amount of power, and corporate is notoriously ruthless when it comes to protecting its brand, especially when a rogue franchise manager is caught stealing from the tip pool, falsifying inventory reports, and emotionally abusing his staff." Rick's jaw dropped. How could you possibly know about the tip pool?" "Because I audited the books myself," Charlotte replied, taking a step forward, closing the distance between them. The air around her seemed to crackle with absolute authority. "I listened to the audio recordings of you berating the pastry chef until she cried. I watched the hidden camera footage of you physically shoving a freezing, elderly man back into a winter storm. I documented every single breach of your franchise agreement over the past 2 weeks." She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and withdrew a sleek, matte black business card with the gold-embossed Apex Hospitality crest. She flicked her wrist, tossing it lightly onto the hostess stand, right on top of Anthony's foreclosure documents. "Read it," "Rick!" Charlotte commanded. Rick's hands were shaking violently as he picked up the heavy cardstock. His eyes darted across the gold lettering. Charlotte Henderson, Chief Executive Officer, Apex Hospitality Group. The card slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor. All the color drained from his face.